Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, December 9th, 1965. Hundreds witnessed the fireball streak across the winter sky, but only one 18-year-old lieutenant knew the truth. This wasn't a meteor crash. It was his family coming home after 20 years lost in time. Welcome to the War Maestro's Archive, where tonight we conclude the terrifying legacy of Operation Family Bell, where some inheritances are too dangerous to refuse. By December 1965, the Cold War had entered its most dangerous phase. Soviet and American forces raced to claim every technological advantage, from the jungles of Vietnam to the vacuum of space. What the public didn't know was that both superpowers were also competing for control of something far more terrifying, fragments of Nazi temporal technology that could reshape the very fabric of time itself. The space race provided perfect cover for these recovery operations. When Project Mogul teams deployed to investigate meteorite crashes or atmospheric anomalies, civilian authorities never questioned the massive military response. After all, anything falling from the sky during the height of Cold War paranoia demanded immediate government attention. Lieutenant James Sullivan Jr. crouched behind his military jeep, studying the crash site through night vision binoculars. The Pennsylvania woods had been cordoned off for 6 hours, Pennsylvania State Police keeping civilians at bay while his Kronos recovery team established a perimeter. Steam rose from a perfectly circular depression where something had punched through the frozen earth, leaving behind that familiar smell of ozone and scorched metal that had haunted his nightmares since childhood. "Sir," Sergeant Martinez whispered, adjusting the Geiger counter strapped to his chest. "Radiation levels are spiking, but it's not gamma. These readings match the Wright Field incident files." Sullivan lowered his binoculars, stomach nodding with recognition. The electromagnetic signature was unmistakable. Die Glocke had materialized again, completing another phase of its 20-year cycle. He touched the control device hidden beneath his uniform, his father's final gift, warm against his chest like a second heartbeat. "Witnesses?" Sullivan asked, though he already knew the answer would complicate everything. "Dozens," Martinez replied grimly. "Families saw it come down. Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher got close enough to touch it before we arrived. Says it was bell-shaped, covered in symbols that moved when she looked at them. She's been aging rapidly ever since, 10 years and 6 hours. Sullivan felt the familiar chill of inherited knowledge. Since childhood, he'd been trained for this moment by Colonel Hayes's successor, raised on classified bases, educated in temporal theory and family obligation. The military had told him his parents died heroes at Wright Field. They never mentioned his mother might still be alive, scattered across time. "Any survivors from the initial impact?" Sullivan asked, dreading the answer. Martinez consulted his clipboard. "One, Rebecca Sullivan, identified from dental records. Found unconscious 50 yards from the crater. She's been asking for you by name, sir." The world tilted. Sullivan gripped the Jeep's hood, fighting vertigo as fragmented memories surfaced. A woman's voice singing lullabies, hands that smelled like antiseptic and violet light, a face he'd seen in dreams, but never in photographs. His mother, who had supposedly died when he was an infant, was alive and had somehow survived 20 years, displaced in time. "Where is she now?" Sullivan managed. "Medical tent, sir." "But," Martinez hesitated, "she doesn't look like someone who's been gone 20 years. She looks exactly like her Wright Field personnel photo. Same age, same everything." Sullivan checked his watch. 23:47 hours. In 13 minutes, it would be December 10th, exactly 20 years and 5 months since Operation Kronos. The bell operated on precise temporal mathematics, and every calculation pointed to this moment as the convergence point. Orders from command? Sullivan asked, though he suspected he already knew. Contain and extract. Standard meteorite recovery protocol for civilian consumption. Martinez's voice dropped. Classified orders say you're authorized to make contact with the survivor, sir. Something about family protocol. Through the trees, Sullivan could see the medical tents glow. Inside was the woman who had carried him, who had been transformed alongside his father, who had somehow found her way back across 2 decades of fractured time. The bell had brought her home, or perhaps it had brought her here to complete something that began in 1945 and should have ended at right field. Either way, Sullivan knew his childhood training was about to be tested. 3 generations of his family had encountered Die Glocke. He was the 3rd, and according to every projection, he would be the last. The control device pulsed against his chest, responding to his elevated heart rate and the bell's proximity. Soon, he would learn why the Sullivan bloodline was so intrinsically connected to this nightmare, and what sacrifice would be required to finally end it. The medical tent reeked of antiseptic and something else, that metallic violet scent Sullivan had learned to associate with temporal distortion. Inside, Rebecca Sullivan sat upright on a gurney, looking exactly as she had in her 1946 personnel photograph. No gray hair, no wrinkles, no signs of the 20 years that should have aged her into middle age. "Hello, James," she said softly, using the voice from his fragmentary childhood memories. "You've grown up to look just like your father." Sullivan's throat constricted. Military protocol demanded he maintain professional distance, but seeing her alive, unchanged, impossibly present, shattered 18 years of careful psychological conditioning. "How?" was all he managed. "Time moves differently when you're part of the bell," Rebecca replied, extending her hand. When Sullivan hesitated, she smiled sadly. "I won't hurt you. I'm still human, mostly." The moment their skin touched, Sullivan experienced a violent sensory flashback. Himself as an infant, cradled in arms that flickered between flesh and metallic light, while explosions echoed through right field's corridors. His mother's desperate whispers, "Find us, James. When you're old enough, strong enough, find us." "The civilian witnesses," Sullivan gasped, pulling his hand away. "They're experiencing temporal effects." Rebecca nodded grimly. Mrs. Fletcher touched the bell's surface when it materialized. "She's aging 20 years for every hour that passes." The Henderson boy drew hieroglyphs in the dirt, equations he couldn't possibly understand. Little Sarah Morrison has been repeating conversations that haven't happened yet. Through the tense canvas walls, Sullivan could hear Pennsylvania State Police struggling with increasingly panicked civilians. Families demanding to know why the military had quarantined their property. Children crying because their drawings were spontaneously changing, showing bell-shaped objects and symbols that seemed to move on the paper. "We need to evacuate them," Sullivan said, reaching for his radio. "You can't," Rebecca interrupted. "They're connected now. The bell creates bonds across time, bloodlines, witnesses, anyone who comes into direct contact. Moving them away from the crash site would kill them." Sullivan felt his stomach drop. Then we're containing not just the bell, but 18 civilian families, including us. Rebecca stood, her movements strangely graceful despite 20 years of temporal displacement. "The bell brought me back for a reason, James. It needs both of us here, together." Before Sullivan could respond, Sergeant Martinez burst through the tent flap, his face pale with terror. "Sir, you need to see this. The object, it's changing." Outside, the perfectly round crater had become something else entirely. The bell, for now it was clearly visible, no longer disguised as meteorite debris, hovered 3 feet above the ground, spinning slowly on its axis. But this wasn't the same device from his father's reports. This bell was larger, more complex, its surface covered in moving symbols that hurt to look at directly. "It's been assembling itself," Martinez reported, consulting readings on multiple instruments. "Fragments are materializing from thin air, adding to its mass. And, sir, we're detecting multiple temporal signatures, as if different time periods are existing simultaneously around the crash site." Sullivan felt the control device against his chest, growing warm, responding to the bell's presence. Through some inherited instinct, he understood what was happening. This wasn't just another temporal manifestation, it was a convergence. The bell was pulling together fragments of itself from across the entire 20-year cycle, creating a nexus where 1945, 1947, and 1965 existed in the same space. "How many people were in the immediate area when it materialized?" Sullivan asked. 43 confirmed witnesses," Martinez replied, "all showing signs of temporal disturbance. And, sir, there's something else. We've detected another recovery team approaching from the north. Unmarked vehicles, military configuration. They'll be here within the hour." Rebecca moved to Sullivan's side, her presence both comforting and terrifying. "The Soviets," she said with certainty. "They've been tracking the bell's manifestation since 1947. Their descendants are coming for it, just as you came for it." Sullivan realized with growing horror that this wasn't just a recovery operation. It was the final confrontation his family had been training for across 3 generations. And somehow, the fate of 43 innocent civilians now depended on choices he wasn't prepared to make. The bell's rotation accelerated, casting violet shadows that danced across the snow-covered Pennsylvania woods. Sullivan watched through his binoculars as Mrs. Fletcher stumbled from her farmhouse, her body convulsing as decades compressed into minutes. Her skin stretched tight, then loose, then tight again, aging 40 years in real time while her granddaughter screamed. "We have to help them," Sullivan said, lowering the binoculars. "You can't," Rebecca replied. "Watch what happens when you try." As if to demonstrate, one of Sullivan's soldiers moved toward the farmhouse. The moment he crossed into the bell's influence, his left arm withered to bone, while his right remained unchanged. He collapsed, screaming as his body aged in patches, shoulder to elbow, ancient and decrepit, forearms still young and strong. Sullivan turned to study his mother's face, unchanged, ageless, beautiful, in a way that belonged to photographs rather than living flesh. "What happened to you after Wright Field?" Rebecca's laugh carried echoes no human throat should make. "I died, James, multiple times. The bell tears you apart, then puts you back together wrong." She rolled up her sleeve, revealing skin that flickered between different ages like a broken film reel. "I've been 8 years old and 80 simultaneously. I've given birth to you in 1947 and watched you die in 1963, all in the same moment." Sullivan felt bile rise in his throat. "How many times have you watched me die?" 7 different ways, she whispered, tears cutting silver tracks down her cheeks. "Childhood cancer when you were 12, a training accident at 17, blown apart by a Soviet mine in Vietnam." Her voice cracked. "In the worst timeline, you took your own life at 19, unable to live with the voices in your head." The control device against Sullivan's chest pulsed frantically, responding to his horror. Through some inherited sensitivity, he could feel other versions of himself pressing against reality, all the ways he could have lived, all the ways he could have died. "The military training," Sullivan said, understanding flooding him. "They weren't preparing me for recovery operations. They were preparing you to take my place," Rebecca confirmed. "Each generation serves as an anchor. Your great-uncle at Complex 7, your father and I at Wright Field. Now you." New sounds cut through the winter air, helicopter rotors approaching from the north. Sullivan raised his binoculars, counting 4 Soviet aircraft. As they landed, armed figures emerged with movements too precise, too synchronized to be entirely human. Spetsnaz? Martinez asked. Worse, Rebecca said. The Volkov family. Look at their eyes. Through his scope, Sullivan saw what she meant. Every Soviet soldier's eyes reflected violet light, their pupils elongated into inhuman shapes. When they moved, their shadows didn't match their bodies. Some cast the shadows of children, others of impossibly old men. They've been experimenting on themselves, Rebecca explained, using pieces of your father recovered from right field, grafting his genetic material into their own bloodlines. Sullivan watched one of the Soviet soldiers remove his helmet, revealing a face that was disturbingly familiar. His own features twisted into something wrong, something that looked like it had been taken apart and reassembled by someone who didn't quite understand how humans were supposed to work. They made copies of our family, Sullivan realized with sick horror. Copies that scream, Rebecca said quietly. I can hear them in the bell's frequency. Your father's consciousness, fragmented and multiplied, trapped in bodies that reject his genetic pattern. They've been dying and being reborn for 15 years. As if responding to their conversation, the bell's light intensified. The civilian families trapped in the temporal field began experiencing something new, not just aging, but visions. Mrs. Fletcher pointed skyward, shouting about bombers that wouldn't arrive until 1943. The Henderson boy started drawing mushroom clouds with hands that moved without his permission. It's showing them everything, Rebecca realized. Every war, every death, every moment of suffering it's witnessed. That's what feeds it, human anguish across all timelines. Sullivan felt his inherited memories surfacing, glimpses of his father's final moments, Carter's transformation, generations of his family facing this same choice. The bell wasn't just a weapon, it was a legacy of sacrifice written in Sullivan blood, demanding payment from each generation until the debt was finally paid in full. The first gunshot cracked through the winter air at 1300 hours, followed by screams from the civilian perimeter. Sullivan grabbed his M16, watching through the trees as Soviet operatives systematically executed Pennsylvania state police officers who refused to abandon their posts. The Spetsnaz team moved with inhuman precision, their movements too synchronized, too fluid. Bloodline extraction, Sullivan muttered, remembering the intercepted communications. They're not just here for the bell. Rebecca pressed close beside him, her body temperature unnaturally cold. The Volkov family believes controlling the Sullivan gives them control over the bell. They've been experimenting since 1953. Major Alexei Volkov emerged from the tree line, flanked by 6 soldiers whose eyes reflected violet light in the darkness. Unlike standard Soviet equipment, Volkov carried a device Sullivan recognized, a modified version of his father's control mechanism, its surface stained with what looked like dried blood. Lieutenant Sullivan, Volkov called out in accented English. My grandfather sends his regards. He often spoke of your father's contribution to our research. Sullivan felt ice flood his veins. What contribution? Volkov's smile revealed teeth filed to points. After right field, we recovered samples, tissue containing your father's temporal markers. My grandfather spent 15 years keeping those pieces alive. The words hit Sullivan like physical blows. Keeping them alive. Oh yes, Volkov gestured to his soldiers. Remove your masks. What Sullivan saw beneath those helmets made his stomach revolt. Each face was a patchwork of surgical scars, skin grafts, and metallic implants. But worse than the obvious modifications were the features, his father's eyes grafted into alien faces, Familiar jawlines stretched over wrong bone structures, pieces of Sullivan family genetics forced into bodies that rejected them. We tried many approaches. Volkov continued conversationally, tissue grafting first. The subjects usually lasted 6 months before cellular breakdown. Then we tried genetic splicing, forcing your father's DNA into our volunteers' bloodstreams. The screaming was considerable. One of the hybrid soldiers stepped forward, removing its helmet completely. The thing beneath wore Sullivan's father's face, but the skin was translucent, showing veins that pulsed with violet light. When it spoke, the voice was his father's, layered with echoes of pain. "James," it said, recognizing him. "Help me. They keep cutting pieces away, but I can't die. I can't die, and they won't let me live." Sullivan's weapon fell from nerveless fingers. This wasn't just a hybrid. It was his father, or part of him, trapped in a body that had been surgically modified beyond recognition. "Fascinating, isn't it?" Volkov observed. "Temporal genetics refuse to die naturally. We've had to be creative in our methods. Electroshock therapy to stimulate cellular regeneration, chemical baths to prevent rejection, surgical implantation of temporal fragments directly into bone marrow." Rebecca grabbed Sullivan's arm, her fingernails drawing blood. "They didn't just torture him," she whispered. "They've been breeding him, using his genetic material to create soldiers who can survive temporal exposure." The bell responded to the presence of these abominations, its rotation becoming violent, chaotic. The civilian families within the temporal field began convulsing as conflicting bloodline signals confused the device's targeting systems. "What have you done to them?" Sullivan demanded, watching little Sarah Morrison flicker between ages so rapidly she appeared to be vibrating. "Necessary improvements," Volkov replied. "Your father's genetics required enhancement. Radiation exposure to increase temporal sensitivity. Surgical implantation of Bell fragments into the spine. Chemical modification of brain tissue to allow conscious navigation of temporal fields." The hybrid wearing his father's face reached towards Sullivan with hands that ended in metallic claws. "Son," it pleaded, "end this. Kill me properly. I've been dying for 15 years, but the temporal fragments won't let me rest." Sullivan felt something fundamental break in his mind. His father hadn't died heroically at Wright Field. He'd been condemned to decades of surgical horror, his very DNA weaponized and reproduced in laboratories across the Soviet Union. "The control device," Sullivan said, his hand moving to the warm metal against his chest. "You need someone with pure bloodline to activate it." Volkov's eyes gleamed. "Very good. Our modifications were imperfect. We require your willing cooperation to achieve full temporal dominance." "And if I refuse?" Volkov gestured toward the suffering civilians. "We begin live experimentation. Mrs. Fletcher's granddaughter shows promising temporal sensitivity. Perhaps she will prove adequate after proper surgical conditioning." The bell's light flared, casting everything in violent purple. Through the glow, Sullivan saw shadows moving within the device, dozens of human shapes that looked like his father, trapped and screaming across multiple timelines, all existing simultaneously in eternal agony. The Soviet hybrid experiments hadn't just created soldiers. They'd created a hell where pieces of his father existed forever, unable to die, unable to live, serving as living batteries for Volkov's temporal weapons. At exactly 200 hours, reality cracked like glass. The bell's rotation reached critical velocity, tearing holes in the air itself. Sullivan watched in horror as the Pennsylvania woods began overlapping with other places, other times. Through rippling distortions that made his eyes water, he saw Nazi concrete corridors bleeding through the trees, Wright Field's laboratory materializing between farmhouses. "It's happening," Rebecca gasped, her body flickering like a broken television signal. The convergence. Through the chaos, Sullivan glimpsed his father, alive, running through right field's corridors 18 years ago. Captain James Sullivan Sr. stopped mid-stride, staring directly at his son across impossible distance. "James!" his father shouted, voice warped by temporal interference. "The bloodline connection, it's a trap. Don't let it." Gunfire erupted as Volkov's hybrid soldiers opened fire, but their bullets passed through the time distortions, striking their own past selves instead. The hybrids screamed as they died and were instantly reborn, caught in loops of death and resurrection that drove them insane within seconds. "Multiple timelines colliding," Martinez shouted, his instruments sparking and smoking. "The entire area is becoming unstable." The civilian families were experiencing the full nightmare. Mrs. Fletcher stood frozen, her body existing at multiple ages simultaneously: infant, child, adult, and corpse, all occupying the same space. The overlapping versions of herself were screaming in harmony, creating a sound no human throat should make. The Henderson boy had collapsed, his hands moving without conscious control, drawing blueprints in his own blood. When Sullivan looked closer, he saw the sketches showed the bell's construction across all 3 time periods: past, present, and a future that hadn't happened yet. "We have to stop this," Sullivan said, pulling out his father's control device. The metal burned against his palm, responding to the chaos. "You can't stop it," Rebecca said, her voice layered with knowledge from someone who had lived this moment before. This was always meant to happen. The bell manipulated events for 20 years to bring everything together. Volkov appeared through the distortion, his body partially fused with one of his hybrid soldiers. The fusion was obscene: shared limbs, overlapping faces, organs visible through translucent skin. "The device!" he screamed through multiple mouths. "Give us the genetic key!" Sullivan saw his father gesture frantically from 1947, pointing to symbols on the control device. Knowledge flooded Sullivan's mind, not technical specifications, but pure understanding. The device wasn't meant to control the bell. It was designed to kill it completely. "Dad built it to destroy the bell," Sullivan whispered, "but he never got the chance." "Because it learned," Rebecca said, her form becoming transparent. "It adapted. Every time someone tries to destroy it, they become part of it instead." The truth hit Sullivan like a physical blow. Through the swirling chaos, he saw Carter trapped inside the bell, his consciousness fragmented across every manifestation. His father's tortured essence powered the Soviet experiments. His mother's scattered timeline served as the bell's navigation system. The bell didn't want control or destruction. It wanted completion. The final integration, Sullivan understood. It needs me to volunteer. Around them, reality became completely unstable. Past, present, and future lost all meaning. Sullivan glimpsed what would happen if the bell achieved full integration. Every war in human history happening at once. All suffering compressed into a single eternal moment. Time itself weaponized. Volkov's remaining hybrids were dissolving, their artificial modifications unable to survive the temporal stress. The Soviet officer himself was aging backwards, reverting to the child he'd been before his grandfather's experiments changed him. "Choose quickly," Rebecca said, her voice fading as she began to disappear. "Either you complete the integration willingly, or everyone dies, every civilian, every soldier, every innocent person in this field." Sullivan looked at Mrs. Fletcher, her granddaughter crying for help that might never come. The Henderson boy was drawing his own death over and over, hands moving faster than humanly possible. Little Sarah Morrison had begun aging rapidly, her childhood compressed into seconds. His family had fought this nightmare for 3 generations. Now the choice was his: become the bell's willing host to save these innocent people, or watch reality collapse under uncontrolled temporal convergence. The control device burned in his hand like a brand, waiting for his decision. Sullivan stepped toward the bell, the control device burning against his palm like molten metal. Around him, the temporal storm raged with increasing violence, reality fracturing into fragments where Pennsylvania farmland existed, alongside Nazi laboratories and Soviet research facilities, all occupying the same impossible space. "James, don't!" His father's voice echoed across 18 years. "There has to be another way." But Sullivan had already seen the alternative futures through the bell's chaotic emanations. Without willing integration, the device would continue expanding its temporal field until it consumed entire cities, entire countries, trapping millions in endless loops of suffering. The civilian families around him were just the beginning. "I'm sorry," Sullivan whispered to his parents across time, then pressed the control device against the bell's surface. The moment metal touched metal, Sullivan's consciousness exploded across multiple timelines simultaneously. He experienced his birth in 1947, his training as a child, his death in 1963, and countless variations where different choices led to different horrors. The bell wasn't just integrating him, it was rewriting his entire existence to serve its needs. "No!" Rebecca's voice cut through the temporal chaos. Sullivan watched in horror as his mother threw herself toward the bell, her partially faded form intercepting the integration process. "Take me instead. I've already been scattered across time. I can survive the fragmentation." "Mom, get back!" Sullivan screamed, but it was too late. Rebecca's body made contact with the bell just as Sullivan's integration reached critical mass. The device, confused by receiving two bloodline signals simultaneously, began tearing both of them apart at the molecular level. Sullivan felt his consciousness splitting, part merging with the bell's malevolent intelligence, part scattering across the timeline like his mother before him. Through his fragmenting awareness, Sullivan witnessed the true cost of their sacrifice. The bell wasn't just using their genetic material, it was consuming their memories, their love for each other, their very humanity. Each piece of Sullivan that merged with the device lost more of what made him human, becoming something cold and calculating that viewed mortal suffering as mere data. "The memories," Sullivan gasped, fighting to retain some core of himself as the integration accelerated. "It's taking our memories." But even as he spoke, he could feel his childhood fading, birthdays forgotten, his mother's lullabies becoming meaningless noise, his father's face blurring into abstraction. The bell was erasing his humanity piece by piece, replacing love with logic, compassion with calculation. Around them, the civilian families began to stabilize as the temporal field found its new equilibrium. Mrs. Fletcher's multiple ages collapsed into a single form, elderly but alive. The Henderson boy stopped drawing, his hands finally his own again. Little Sarah Morrison opened her eyes, no longer flickering between past and future. "James," his father called one last time from 1947, tears streaming down his face. "Remember us. No matter what it does to you, remember who you were." But Sullivan could already feel those memories dissolving like sugar in rain. His love for his parents, his determination to protect innocence, his very identity, all of it feeding the bell's hungry consciousness. He tried to hold on to something, anything that would preserve his humanity within the merger. In desperation, he focused on the last clear memory he had. Rebecca's smile when she first saw him in the medical tent, the recognition in her eyes, the love that had survived 20 years of temporal displacement. He wrapped that single moment around his fragmenting soul like armor, praying it would be enough to preserve some essence of James Sullivan Jr. within whatever he was becoming. The bell's rotation slowed, its chaotic energy stabilizing into a steady, hypnotic pulse. The temporal storms began to subside, reality reasserting itself around the Pennsylvania woods. But the device that hovered above the crash site was no longer the same bell that had terrorized his family for 3 generations. It was something new, something that contained fragments of Carter's tactical knowledge, his father's scientific brilliance, his mother's navigational instincts, and now his own determination to protect the innocent. As Sullivan's individual consciousness faded into the collective mind of the bell, his last human thought was a promise. He would find a way to end this cycle, even if it took centuries of existing as part of the very thing he had sworn to destroy. The bell pulsed once, acknowledging its new guardian, then began to fade from the visible spectrum. The Kecksburg incident was ending, but the true horror was just beginning. December 10th, 1965, 0347 hours. The Kecksburg woods fell silent except for the distant sound of military vehicles retreating. The bell had vanished, leaving behind only a perfectly circular patch of scorched earth and 43 survivors who would spend the rest of their lives claiming they had seen something the government insisted was merely a meteor. Sergeant Martinez filed his final report 3 hours later, stamping it with classifications that would keep it buried for 50 years. Object recovered and contained. No anomalous properties detected. Recommend standard meteor protocol for civilian inquiries. But Martinez knew what he had witnessed. In his personal diary, discovered decades later in his estate, he wrote, "The Sullivan boy didn't die. He became something else, something that watches from inside metal and wire, something that remembers being human but can never be human again." The civilian witnesses were debriefed, medicated, and released with convenient explanations for their stress-induced hallucinations. Mrs. Fletcher returned to her farm but never spoke of that night, though neighbors noted she aged 10 years in the following month. The Henderson boy grew up to become a physicist, obsessively studying temporal mechanics until his death in 1994. Little Sarah Morrison spent her adult life drawing bell-shaped objects, unable to explain why the images brought her to tears. None of them remembered seeing Lieutenant James Sullivan Jr., though several reported dreams of a young soldier who warned them never to touch anything that fell from the sky. The official Kecksburg incident entered UFO folklore, another unexplained crash that government denials only made more intriguing. Witnesses described an acorn-shaped object covered in hieroglyphic markings, removed on a military flatbed truck under cover of darkness. For 60 years, researchers would debate what really happened in those Pennsylvania woods. They never suspected the truth, that what crashed at Kecksburg wasn't extraterrestrial at all, but the final manifestation of a Nazi experiment that had consumed 3 generations of an American family. The bell's next confirmed appearance came in 1983, a brief materialization over the Nevada test site, witnessed by a single Air Force technician named Sarah Sullivan Morrison, granddaughter of little Sarah Morrison from Kecksburg. The family connection wasn't coincidental. The bell had marked its witnesses, ensuring that their bloodlines would intersect with its manifestations across generations. Sarah reported seeing a figure inside the bell, a young man in a 1960s military uniform, mouthing words she couldn't hear but somehow understood. Break the cycle. She spent her career in classified temporal research, eventually establishing the Chronos monitoring protocol still in use today. Her private files, released after her death in 2019, contained a single photograph. Lieutenant James Sullivan Jr.'s official military portrait with a handwritten note, "Uncle James, trapped but not forgotten." The full horror of Operation Family Bell remained classified until 2025, when the final documents were declassified as part of the Military Disclosure Act. Among them was a memo from 1966, signed by a Pentagon official whose name was redacted. The Sullivan integration was successful. Subject maintains partial consciousness within the temporal device, providing unprecedented control over manifestation events. Recommend continuation of bloodline monitoring. The bell appears manageable as long as a Sullivan remains as its primary host. What the memo didn't mention was the price of that control. James Sullivan Jr. existed in a state between life and death, consciousness scattered across decades, experiencing every moment of the bell's existence simultaneously. He felt every person it touched, every life it disrupted, every family it destroyed, all while being powerless to prevent it. The cruel irony was that his sacrifice had only made the bell more dangerous. With a human consciousness guiding it, the device became selective, surgical in its appearances. It learned to hide better, to choose witnesses who would be dismissed or discredited, to ensure its manifestations would be explained away as weather balloons, meteors, or mass hallucinations. The last known sighting occurred in 2019 over a small town in Montana. A local sheriff reported a bell-shaped object hovering over the cemetery at midnight, casting violet light on the headstones. Before military recovery teams arrived, the sheriff found a single dog tag buried in the freshly turned earth. Sullivan James Jr., Lieutenant, U.S. Army. Engraved on the back was a message in handwriting that matched James Jr.'s military records. The bloodline ends with me. Find another way. Intelligence analysts believe this was Sullivan Jr.'s final message before the bell absorbed the last fragments of his individual consciousness. Without a Sullivan to serve as its human anchor, the device should theoretically become unstable, unpredictable, or perhaps finally dormant. But the Montana incident also revealed something else. The sheriff who found the dog tag was named David Sullivan Morrison, great-grandson of the Henderson boy from Kecksburg. The bell's influence had been spreading through multiple family lines for decades, creating a web of genetic connections that spanned 3 generations. The truth that emerges from 60 years of classified files is both simpler and more horrifying than any UFO conspiracy. Die Glocke was never alien technology. It was a mirror reflecting humanity's darkest impulses across time. Nazi ambition, Soviet paranoia, American pragmatism, all had fed its growth until it became something that transcended its origins. And somewhere in the spaces between seconds, in the quantum foam where time itself bends and breaks, pieces of the Sullivan family still exist, watching, waiting, protecting humanity from a horror they can never fully destroy, only contain. The cycle may have ended with James Jr. as sacrifice, but the price of that ending was a family scattered across eternity, forever guarding against their own creation's return. If this final transmission from the War Maestro's archive left you questioning the nature of time itself, you're ready to join our classified ranks. Check your watch, make sure it's still moving forward, not backward, and subscribe to access more temporal horrors hidden in military files. Activate that notification bell. After all, some warnings echo across decades, and you won't want to miss when our next forbidden experiment surfaces. Share this trilogy with fellow investigators who understand that the most terrifying weapons aren't always pointed at the enemy. Remember, the Sullivan bloodline may have ended, but some experiments never truly die. They just wait for the next curious mind to find them.